What's good, team? Welcome to another Small James coding tutorial where today we're going to be building a beginner React project. It's going to be a neat little tutorial. We're going to be building a compound interest calculator. Essentially how it works is we enter an initial amount, say to $20,000, monthly contribution of 400, interest rate 10%, number of years over 30 years, ask it how rich it'll be, and it's going to tell us that in 30 years time we'll have $1.2 million. If we didn't compound, we'd only have 164,000, and so the difference that compounding makes is 1.05 million. We can reset that and go all over again. The whole app is super responsive, so it's a brilliant little project if you're looking to learn React, add it to your portfolio, get comfortable with use state, use effect, componentry, responsive web design, all that good stuff. The other thing worth noting is that the app is styled with TailwindCSS, which is absolutely popping at the moment, so it's a great thing to learn. And all around, it's just a brilliant tutorial to really consolidate your React skills. Links to the GitHub and the documentation will be in the description down below, so be sure to check those out should you need them. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's super appreciated. And without further ado, let's dive into the code. So we're going to start off over here in the TailwindCSS documentation for initializing a React project with Vite. Now this documentation will be linked in the description down below, so be sure to check that out if you need it. And the first thing we're going to be doing is typing in npm create Vite at latest, give the name of the project, so it's going to be compound calc, then dash 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 template React. So that's going to be a React project. Now Vite has gone ahead and created that project for us, so we can now cd into it. So it's going to be cd compound calc. And now we can go ahead and open that up inside of our Visual Studio Code editor, or whatever your trusted editor might be. So now once we're inside here, we can go ahead and open up a new terminal, and the first thing we're going to run is npm install. We're going to copy this command just here, paste it in our terminal, have that execute. That's going to install everything that TailwindCSS needs to work inside of our project. And then after that, we're going to copy this npx command that's going to initialize a TailwindCSS file. So we can see the Tailwind config file there, the post.css config file. And finally, we can go ahead and copy these settings into their respective files. So we'll just copy that one in. And then finally, we'll copy these base styles over into the index.css file. We'll get rid of everything in there and just paste that in instead. So that's going to be everything we need to get Tailwind running inside of our application. While we're here, we may as well just take a quick look at what files we're actually working with. So we can see that we have, three main directories. We've got a node modules, a public, and a source directory. The node modules is where all our npm packages are saved. We don't really have to interact with that. The public is where we would store any, assets or static assets that we might serve with the project. And then the source directory is where all the magic happens. So in here you can see we have some other additional assets and 4 files. We have a main.jsx, an index.css, an app.jsx, and an app.css. The one that we don't need is this app.css. That's because we're using Tailwind. So we can go ahead and remove that. We need the index.css to import the Tailwind styles. The app.jsx is essentially the entry point of our whole application. So we can come in here and clean out everything that we don't need, which is just about everything really, including that app.css. We can just return an empty div for the second. So this is going to be the entry point of our app, and all our subcomponentry will be within this file. And then this app.css gets rendered inside this index.html inside of the root div via this main.jsx. So it essentially selects the root element and renders out our app component within it. And here you can see we have the import for our Tailwind styles, and that's pretty much how React works. So in saying that, now that we have a blank app, we can actually go ahead and type npm run develop, and that is going to start up our program on localhost 5173. So here you can see we have a blank app, and if I just type James we get James rendering onto the screen. And if we try out some Tailwind styles, so we could say text green 400, that text changes color, so we can rest assured that everything is working perfectly. So that's our whole app configured, which is amazing. The next thing we're going to do is start off with all of the logic componentry and JSX that we will need for our compound interest calculator. And that is going to start off with us creating a new folder inside of the source directory, and that is going to be components. So in here, we're going to have all of our componentry. And the first file we're going to make in there is a layout.jsx. We're going to type RFC inside of this component to, create a default component just like that. And this component is going to be a wrapper around our entire application. It's going to receive the props, and we're going to render it out inside of our app by, rendering as we would a traditional HTML tag. So it's going to be layout, just like that. We import it from the components library, and now we have an opening and closing layout tag. Now this layout tag is going to wrap everything inside of our app. However, now you can see that this div has gone missing. We no longer have James coming on the page, and so the way that we can resolve that is by receiving the children from the props. So the children is the first type of props that we're going to look at. So we can just in here render out children. And now that will show up on the page once again. And the children is just anything that is wrapped within the opening and closing tags for that component. What this is going to allow us to do is define a whole lot of componentry in here, as we'll see in a minute. And it will always be wrapped by this layout just here, where we can also have a header component. So this is just going to say header, that should show up on the screen. And then after the children, we're going to have a footer component, and that can say footer, and that comes up underneath. So that's our layout component done. And that's the first way of also, you can communicate props between componentry. The next thing we're going to do is actually just come back into this for 1 second. Inside of our header, we're just going to have an h1 tag, and this is going to have compound interest calculator, just like that. So that's going to be the header or name of our application. And then inside of our app, we can go ahead and make the next components that we're going to need, which is going to be a bunch of different inputs. So we're going to need an input that takes in an initial investment amount, it takes in a monthly addition or contribution, it takes an annual interest rate, and also a number of years. So they're going to be 4 inputs, and that's going to be amongst 2 different types of inputs. So we can come into our components file and make a new file, and one could be called numeric input.jsx. We can RFC that component just in here. Notice how whenever I define a component, I always initialize it with a capital letter. And then we can have a slider input.jsx and RFC that. This is going to be for our slider input. We can have one more component, which is going to be our calculate button.jsx. We can RFC that component. And then we can have one more component that's called calculated amounts.jsx. And we can RFC that as well. So these are all the components for our application. And the reason why React is so loved is because of the component layout that it uses. It just means that all of your logic is very segregated into whatever it pertains to. So I know that if I'm affecting the layout, I just have to come into the layout, and that's where I'm going to find my logic. If I wanted to, fiddle with the calculated amounts, I know exactly where to go. It's all very compartmentalized and effectively and efficiently organized. So now that I've created all of these components, I can go ahead and remove this text just here. Or maybe what we do instead is we just have a little paragraph that might say X, Y, or Z. So this is a little blurb, just like that. So that shows up. Underneath of our blurb, we can have the numeric input. So that's going to be a component. We can render that out. We'll have to just import that. So we'll import numeric input from dot slash components slash numeric input. We can save that, and that is unhappy because I cannot spell that correctly. So there we have our numeric input. We're going to need 3 of those, and then after that we're going to have our slider input just here, so we can render that out on the screen. Notice how these aren't going to have any children content, so I just self-closed the tag, and now we can import slider input from dot slash components slash slider input, and then we also need our calculate button. Close that. We need our calculated amounts. Have those 2 components as well. So I will just have the calculated button, and finally the calculated amounts. So there is all our componentry done, and you can see how neat and tidy this looks inside of our main app. We know where everything is. It's really easy to get to, and it's all logically structured. So now what we can do is start jumping into each of the components. And the first one that we're going to look at is the numeric input. Now the way that this is going to work is we're going to have an h3 tag that is going to have some sort of title as to what the input pertains to, and then after that we're going to have an input just like that. Now the title doesn't currently exist, so that is something that we are going to pass in via the props. So once we've received it from the props, we can destructure it just like that. This means that we get a lot of code reusability, so we can have a dynamic title instead of having to cut, as opposed to having to hard code this amount, and we can just pass in the title as a prop. So we can say the title is equal to, and whatever we assign to that title is what will be received inside that component. So here we can have initial amount, and now we can see initial amount comes up. Here we can have monthly contribution, just like that. Here we can have interest rate, which is super easy. I'm also going to add another one, which is just the symbol. And this is essentially just going to be the symbol that is, used, or the unit for that amount. So this is going to be a $sign for each of these, and then for the interest rate, it's going to be a percentage. So that's relatively straightforward. If I come back into the numeric input, what I can do is just after here, render out the symbol. I can destructure that. So now we get the symbol, and I can even go ahead and wrap that inside of parentheses. So now we know exactly what the amounts are. We have our inputs just here. So there's our little input that we can type into. We'll come and style this shortly. And now the next one we're going to do is the slider input. And this is going to be similar. So we're going to have the same h3, just like that. We're going to have a very similar props. So we're just going to copy that in. We'll have props just in here. And then after that, we can have an input, except this one is going to be type range. We're going to have a min equal to 1, a max equal to 60. And then we can go ahead and close that, remove the second one, self-closing input. And now you can see that we have a little range slider right there. If we come back into our app, we can have these same props just passed in. So this is going to be number of years that we have this for. So now that's showing up. And what we're going to do in here is, instead of having the symbol, we're going to have the value, which is going to be the current amount of that range slider. So this is just going to be value. And that's going to be a numeric amount that doesn't exist yet. And that was the wrong one to change that in. It should be changed in here. Value and value. So those are all of our inputs done. So now that we have all our inputs done, the next thing that we have to do is make sure that we're tracking their values. And since that's a dynamic input in React, we're going to make sure that we use stated to track that. Now useState is essentially just assigning a constant variable and with a few extra steps. It's relatively straightforward. And as I mentioned before, it's just a way that React can keep track of the things that are changing on the page that the user is interacting with and re-render the page so that the information on the page always reflects the changes that the user may have made. So we can define some state just here. This can be, value and set value, for example, is equal to useState, and we can provide a default value or just leave it empty. Since these are numeric amounts for the range inputs, I'm just going to start them off at 0. And now what we can do is we can set the value equal to value, and we can say on change of the input, we have an arrow function that receives the event, and we can say set value and pass in the new value, which is e.target.value. And that is going to, and we're going to have to make sure that we import useState from React. And that is going to ensure that all our amounts are effectively tracked on our page, so that all works nicely. And every time they change, we receive the event and we set the value. We use the setter function and we assign the new value, or we update this value. So value is essentially the variable, and the set value is the way that we set the value and we re-render the page. Now the issue with doing this is that we have to be able to calculate the amounts in our main component. And we can't unfortunately pass that state up our component tree. We can only pass it down. So I would only be able to pass the state down to components that are rendered inside here. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm actually going to leave the input with these generic values and set value functions, except I'm going to destructure them out of the props, just like that. And then inside of our app, we can do the same thing. We can change our state input to make sure that it's coming from React, just in here. And I can define states to manage the individual values from each input in here. So I could, for example, define the first one to be init amount and set init amount is equal to useState, and that's just going to have a default value of 0. You can see that the way that the functions are typically named is, we have the variable and then we put set in front of the variable name for the setter function. And I'm just going to duplicate this 4 times. The second one is going to be monthly contribution, and then we can have set monthly contribution. The third one is going to be interest rate, and then we can have set interest rate. That's also going to be 0. And the last one can be number of years and set number of years. So that's all nice and easy and working, which is handy dandy. And now what we do is we were receiving the value and the set value from the props. So we just have to make sure that we pass all that information down. So we can say value is equal to a particular value, and we can say set value, which is going to be the name of the setter function. And we can pass all of this down. So the value for this first one, which is the initial amount, is going to be init amount. The set value function is going to pass a reference to that function. The monthly contribution goes to the second one. The set monthly contribution goes there. The interest rate goes to this one. Set interest rate is the set value function. And finally, for number of years, this also has to be the same. So we have to have a value equal to number of years, and then a set value equal to number of years. And now what will happen inside of our components is when we call set value inside of our numeric input, that's essentially the same as setting the interest rate. So depending on whichever function we pass down, that's what gets called whenever we call set value. And now it means that our state gets managed inside of our main component, which means I have access to all of the variables, and then I can go and calculate the actual, compounded interest final value amount, which is super convenient. This one should be set number of years, just like that. So we're also going to have to make sure that we receive these setter functions inside of our slider input component as well. So just as we have here, nice and easy. And now the next thing we can do is define a function which can be calculate compound interest. And in here, what we can do is we can say let total equal to 0. And we can say, and then we can define a for loop. So we can say for I, let I equals 0. I is less than number of years dot, or just number of years, I plus plus. And essentially what we can do, or the way that the interest works is, we define annual contribution. So let annual contribution equal to monthly contribution times 12. And now every year we can, and the other thing I'm actually just going to do is set the total to the init amount, because we're already starting at the init amount. And then every year what I'm going to do is I'm going to compound that annual interest. So I'm going to say total plus equal to the annual contribution. And then I'm going to say total times equal to the 1 plus the interest rate divided by 100. So what that should do is allow us to calculate that total value. So here what we could do is we could just console total, see what that comes out at. And then after that, we're actually just going to define some state which says final value set final value equal to use state. We'll say 0. We'll say null for the second. And now we can take this function, we can pass it down to our calculate button, which we can just call it evaluate is equal to that. Inside of our calculated button in here, we can receive the props, destructure evaluate out equal props, and we can change this div to be a button that just says how rich will I be ? And now we should actually have a functioning app, to be fair. So if we come over to the console, let's say we set the initial amount to 20,000, we set the monthly contribution to, let's say 400, and we set the interest rate to 10, we set the number of years. Looks like maybe the number of years isn't working. Let's just have a look at the slider input for a second. That should be receiving the value, but it doesn't look like, oh, that's right, we haven't assigned the value. So we have to actually say value is equal to value. And now we also have to assign the on change, take the event, and just as we had before, return set value is equal to e.target.value. So that's going to access the value amount within that slider. So now we can see our slider actually takes the right amount. So this is working all nice and well. And the other thing I'm just going to do is come back into our main app component right here. And I'm just going to make sure that all these amounts are passed in as integers, just so that we don't get any accidental string concatenation. So we're going to pass the integer of the contribution amount. We're going to pass the integer of the number of years. And finally, pass the integer of the interest rate. So that should just about do it. And now we should be able to calculate how rich will I be. Let's just try that once more. 20,400 interest rate of 10 over 30 years. And we're not getting anything, and that's because on our calculate we actually have to assign that as an on-click event, and that's just going to be the function that we have named evaluate as a prop. So if we say how rich will I be, we can see that that's actually calculating the amount for us, and it's like 1.2 million, which is, awesome. So that is a lot of the logic done, which is super convenient. We can actually go ahead and say set final value equal to the total that we have calculated. If I can actually spell that correctly. Total. as such. And what we're going to do in here is for the calculated amounts, we're going to have some conditional rendering. Now there's two ways that we can do it. We can do it in here and we can say if final value exists, and so if this is true as a Boolean, then render this out. If it's false, then don't render it out. So that should actually hide that amount until we calculate it. So if I just do this, 20, 20, number of years, how rich will I be? We can see that now the calculated amount shows up because it exists. We've assigned a, something that represents a true Boolean variable to it. Equally, what you could do is you could come into the calculated amounts. You could receive the final value, so const final value is equal to props, and you could just say if not final value, you could return null from that, and that would be an acceptable alternative. And so, in this case, we can do both of them. So that is essentially all of the logic finished for our application. I'm just going to come into here and hide our footer. Now the next thing we're going to do is wrap our children inside of a main and dive into the styling of our app. Now that we've wrapped it inside of a main, we can come over to our browser and we can go to Google Fonts, and we are going to select some fonts for our application. So here you can see that I've already got them all ready, but we're going to be using Poppins. You're going to want to select all of the non-italicized fonts. And over here, we're just going to copy this whole link tag. And we're going to come into our document, into the index.html, and we're going to paste it inside of these head tags right here. That's going to import the font into our document. While we're in here, we're just going to change the title of our application to Compound Interest Calculator, just like that. So that's super good. And then in here, what we can do is inside of our index.css, we can use the asterisk selector to select everything in our document object model, all of the elements that we have, and we can say font family is equal to Poppins, which we've imported, and then we can provide some backups. So I'm just going to go with this set of backup fonts just here. And now our compound interest calculator has swapped fonts. So that's super handy dandy. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to come over to Font Awesome Icons, and we're going to look up the CDN package 6.0. Once again, all these links are going to be in the description down below. We're going to copy that link tag just there and paste that directly underneath these other link tags inside of our React project. And then what that is going to mean is that we can come over to Font Awesome Icons, come to their icon sets, and we could start selecting the icons. So one that I'm going to take is the money bill. We're going to take the money wave. Just in here, we're going to come into our layout right here and paste this under the header. And so I'm going to have a bunch of them. Let me do that again. Paste one. One thing to note is that class has to be changed to class name inside of React. But now that I've done that, I can duplicate that a whole lot of times. We're going to chuck all of these icons inside of a div. So make sure they're all wrapped inside of the header element. As such, if we come back to our page, we can see that we get all these little money icons, which is, kind of neat. We're also going to need to get the calculator one. We want to make sure that we get the free ones. Copy that, just as the HTML. We're going to come into our calculate button just here, enter this onto a new line, and wrap this inside of an H4. And then after that, paste our icon, remembering that we have to change this back to class name. So that will be our second icon. There we can see we have the little calculate button, which is, handy dandy. And then that's pretty good for the icons. And now we can come back into the layout just here, and we can start off with this top level div. We're going to say class name is equal to min height screen, background slate 950. Well, actually that's going to be 900, text white, we're going to say flex column gap of 10, padding of 4. So it's going to change our whole application to a dark background. We can see that the text white was applied, so that is working. Now what we can do is come to the header. This is going to have a class name of flex column gap of 4, items center justify center, which is going to make sure that everything is centered. We're also going to give this a max width of 800 pixels and a padding Y of 16 on a small screen that becomes padding Y of 20. We're going to give it a width full and an MX of auto. So that's just going to mean that when we are on a bigger screen, it always stays centered. Inside of this div just here, we're going to give this a class of flex item center gap 4. Maybe that's a gap of 2 for each. And also a text is going to be extra large. And we could actually just make it so that on a small screen or larger, so after that breakpoint, it goes to a text of large. So as we come up, that increases. We could even say on a medium, we could say text 2XL. So now when we come up to a medium screen, we can see that it gets even bigger. As for the H1 tag just here, that's going to be text 2XL. On a small screen and bigger, it's going to be text 3XL. And then on a medium screen or bigger, it's going to be text 4XL. So it's going to be nice and big. We're going to change the font weight to semi-bold. So it's going to be nice and fat. And honestly, I might even make this 4, 5, and 6, just so it's real nice and big. We're also going to say text is centered, just like that. So that's pretty easy. I might also just drop these ones down here to a text small. Well, actually, no, we'll say text large. Actually, no, I'm just going to leave that as I had it. However, I might just get rid of 3 of them. Maybe even 1 more. Just so there's only 3. We only need 3. And then what we can do is we can actually just make them way bigger like the main font. So we can say text 3XL on a medium screen, text 4XL, and we can say text 2XL on a base screen. So that's, cute. Probably just increase that gap a little bit up to a 4. So that's all good. Now we come up on a big screen. We've got this nice, clear compound interest calculator. As for this main, we're going to give this a class of flex1, flex column gap of 8. Maybe we can make that a 6. We're going to say max width of 600 pixels. Set the width to full, MX of auto. So that should make sure that it kind of stays relatively centered for us, which is, exactly what it's doing. Then we can come inside of our numeric inputs just here. This is going to have a class of flex col gap 2. So now, our things are going to take the entire width. For this little blurb that we have just here, we're going to say class text center font slate 200, so it's a little bit grayed out. And that should actually be text slate 200, text small. On a medium screen, we can have text base. That can say compound till I die. Nice. What I might also just do is copy this little paragraph tag out of the app and paste it into the layout just after the header, because that should space it out a bit more evenly. And I think that the issue I'm having here is that this header should actually just have a PT of 20 and a PT of 16. And then we can just increase the gaps. So I might say on a small screen, the gap goes to 10, and on a medium screen, the gap goes to 20, and that should actually be 16. So now when I come up, we get, a bigger gap. That's probably too large, to be fair, so maybe I'll say 12 and then 15, which is, much more reasonable. So now that we've done that, I actually don't mind the way that the text is currently looking. However, what I am going to do is come in and style the input. So for this input just here, this is going to have a class of outline none, focus outline none, background transparent. So that should actually be BG trans, if I can spell that, transparent. We're going to have a text of white. We're going to say text of extra small, and then on a small screen we'll say text small. We'll say a duration of 200, a border of slate 600. Actually, no, I changed my mind about that. So what we're going to do is give it a border. Border is going to be transparent initially, and that needs to be a solid border. We're also going to give it a BG of slate 950, so it's going to be extra dark so we can see it there. We'll give it a padding of 2. We'll give it a rounded, so that we have nice rounded corners. And what we're going to do is say on hover, we're going to change the border color to be maybe blue 600. And on focus, it's going to be blue. Focus is going to be border blue 300. So let's see how that looks. So, you focus. So you kind of get this effect. I might make this one darker. So the hover is going to be, maybe that's too dark. Maybe we'll say 700, and we might change this to like a 500. So now you can kind of see how that works. So we hover over one, and then when we focus, it becomes a lighter color, and we can input our amount. Now the other thing that we can notice is that we have to set the type to number so that we can only enter numeric inputs, just like that. So that's all good. We have our monthly contributions. I might bring the gap on this down to 1, so it's a bit tighter. And even inside of the layout, just here, I could possibly bring this main gap down to a 4. And then we can come over to our slider input just here, and we can do a similar thing, class flex col gap 1. So now that occupies the full space. That's all straightforward. We don't really have to worry about styling this too much because that's already finished. And now we can close both of those, and we can come into our calculate button. This is going to be relatively straightforward. It's going to be class flex items center justify center gap maybe 4, padding x of maybe well, actually that will occupy the full width, but we'll say padding y of maybe 4. We're going to give it a background of slate 700 rounded, maybe 600. What about 300, 400? Well, we could actually just say background blue 200. How does that look? I actually think that's quite nice. I'm going to say text slate 900. Or what we could even do is say background blue 400. Yeah, that's probably my favorite. Background blue, just like that. I'm going to change the text size to be uppercase. No, I'm not going to do that. Now we have a cute little calculator, which is kind of fun. And what we're going to do is also say group on this upper element. And in here, I'm going to say group hover is going to be animate spin. So it's going to be a pretty silly effect, but basically when we hover over the button down here, not that you can even see it, let me just resolve that for you. It means that when I hover over it, it's just going to spin like that. And I'm also just going to change the color to be on hover background blue 500, and I'll give it a duration of 200 seconds. So now when we hover, it gets a bit darker, and we get that little spin effect. So the last thing we have to do is the calculate amount. So if we come into our app, here we can see that we had the final value and then the calculated amounts. What we're actually going to do instead is have some different conditional logic. So in here we're going to say if the final amount exists, then what we want to do is render out the calculated amounts. Otherwise, we want to render out everything else in here. So all of this good stuff. So we can put that in there. Now we can, so this is going to be some different conditional logic. So it checks if final value exists. If it does, it renders out that. If not, it renders out all this good information. And so what we can do is we can pass in the final value is equal to final value. While we're at it, we may as well just pass in everything else. So we're going to pass in number of years is equal to number of years. We're going to pass in the monthly contribution is equal to monthly contribution. It's going to be important for some calculations. And finally, we're going to define a different function, which is just going to be reset. And this is just going to set all these amounts back to, their original values. So we're going to say set init amount 0, set monthly contribution 0, set interest rate to 0, set final amount to null, and set number of years to 0. And now we can pass down this reset button just here. Reset. And essentially how this is going to work is if we have 30 years of this, we have a 10% interest rate, 400 monthly contribution, and an initial amount of 20,000. If we calculate, it's going to hide everything else and show the calculated amounts, which is just in here. So this can have a class name of BG blue 400 rounded text white flex col gap gap of maybe 10. And we're also going to justify center and have items center. And in here we're going to have a couple of divs. I think the number is 3 exactly. And each div is going to have a different calculated amount. So what I'm going to do up here is define an object. So this is going to be amounts is equal to this object. We can also receive the other values. So that's going to be reset function. We receive the monthly contributions. We receive the number of years. And so in here we can say final value is equal to final value. That's really easy. We can say ordinary amount is equal to number of years times by the monthly contribution plus the init investment. So we'll have to pass that down as well. Let's just get that. The initial amount. So the initial amount has to be passed down in here. We'll make sure we receive that just so that we can actually see how beneficial it is to invest. So that's going to be the init amount. And then we can calculate the difference from that. So this is going to be difference. And that is going to be equal to final value minus this calculation right here. The other thing I'm going to do is just say compounded underscore amount. Well, I'm actually just going to say amount, and I'm going to wrap this in quotations, and you'll see why in just a second. For the ordinary amount, I'm going to have it just like this. Capitalize ordinary amount, and then finally for the difference, I can do the exact same thing just there, the difference. And what that's going to allow us to do is map over some content in here. So I'm going to use the curly parentheses. We have to pass an array. So I'm going to get the keys in the amounts object, going to map over them, receive the amount index, which is going to be the index of the key. And in here, I'm going to return some additional JSX, just like that. When we use the map, we have to make sure we provide it a unique key. Hence why I get the amount index, which is always going to be unique because it just, there's only one entry at every index. And inside of here, I can give this a class of flex call gap 2. We can have an h2 that has a class of text large, and this can have a, maybe on a small we'll say text extra large, medium text 2XL, and we can say text center, and this can be the amount, which is going to be the key, and then underneath that we can have the actual value, which is going to be amounts at that particular key. So we can see here we have all of our amounts. We can see that we're going to have to do some parse int-ing. So we'll just say parse int on each of these values just here, because we can't go having nans. That's not really much good. And then I can just copy this right there. So let's try that once more. 400, 420, 4 years. How rich will I be? That's still not quite out to be the final. Something's not quite working, but we can resolve that in a second. I'm also just going to give this a font semi-bold, just so that bolds all these components. We can give this whole thing here just a padding of 4 so that it sits inwards a little bit. I might drop the gap down to about a 6. And I think what I'm going to do, instead of having it just like that and with the text center, is I'm actually going to change this just to being a regular flex with item center like we have here. So now we have the compounded amount and then the amount. So we're going to want to put a 2 fixed just here. 2 decimal places should do the trick. We'll put a $sign in front. And then at the very bottom just here, we're going to have a button. This is going to have a class of px4 py2 text center border. Well, actually, instead of having a border, I might just give it a background. Background white, text slate 900. And this is going to say reset. And in here, we'll say rounded MX auto. That's going to be in the middle. I might actually perhaps keep it the full length. I don't mind that. And instead of having the background white, I'm actually going to give it a border solid, border white. Text color of also white. So I'll need to remove this. And there's our little reset button, and we could probably just increase that border width to a 2. And I might just say font bold for the reset, just like that. And when we click this, we're going to have on click and just assign reset. So now when I hit reset, it takes us back to the beginning and sets everything back to the initial amount. So let's just figure out why this calculation isn't working for us exactly. Here we can see that we've got the error, received a nan for the children attribute, calculated amounts, div just there. So that's the issue. What I can just do is console.log the whole equation that I've got just here. So let's just try that real quick. If I console.log that and refresh this page, 1000, 100, 20, 13, we still get a nan. So I might just console.log each of these elements individually. (13) nan and nan. And so that must be because I spelt these wrong. So that's monthly contribution. So that was indeed spelled correctly. and the init amount needs to be the init amount. So let's just try that once more. And obviously I'll update that just here. I think it was just the monthly contributions. So if we refresh this page, we can give that a shot. So let's say $20,400 monthly contribution, 10% interest rate over 30 years. And that is not happy because we have more. So I didn't update it in all of the places, unfortunately. So let's do that once more. 20,400, 10%. And this is going to be 30 years. Touch wood, this works. It totally does. We can see that the compounded amount that we would get is 1.2 million. The ordinary amount, if we just save that, is going to be $32,000 plus the initial amount. So it's going to be 52,000. So we should probably actually, oh no, we do in fact add the initial amount. Oh, this needs to be times by 12. That's my bad. Do that once more, because if it's a monthly contribution, times by 12 months, times by the number of years. So that you get 164,000 as opposed to 1.2 million if you don't compound. So the difference compounding interest can make is $1.05 million. So it's really important to compound your interest. But also, what a neat little React app. The last thing I'll do is just change this to flex 1. It's going to just take up a little bit more space. And I disagree, I'm not going to do that. And then we can reset and do it all over again. Anyway, that's pretty much the whole video. We have a nice little responsive application. We've got some good logic handling. We've got inputs, we've got state, we've got componentry, props, just about everything you could possibly want. If you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's super appreciated. I hope it's helped you learn something about React, and I hope this looks good in your portfolio should you choose to put it there. Thank you so much for watching. Super appreciated. Catch you guys in the next one. Peace.